The conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo has lasted decades, costing countless lives and leaving over 6 million people internally displaced. Recent escalations by militias have had devastating consequences. At the same time, the UN is pulling its forces from the region, which has brought the situation back into international focus. How can the richest country in the world also be one of the poorest? And what can be done about it? In this episode, we'll analyze the humanitarian crisis in Congo, why it's happening, and what the results have been thus far. If you enjoy what we do, then don't forget to like the video, and check out our Patreon for exclusive content and early releases. Congo began as the Congo Free State, the personal property of the King of Belgium, under an exceptionally brutal colonial regime. It is perhaps most infamous for the use of amputation as a form of punishment, severing limbs from those who refused to work or failed to meet quotas. Following several instances of revolutionary upheaval, the Democratic Republic of the Congo won independence from Belgium in 1960. This independence lasted only 2 months. Then came the first Western-backed military coup. Joseph Désiré Mobutu, who was a high-ranking member of the cabinet, had secretly been working with the CIA. He handed the PM over to Western-backed separatists who tortured and killed him. 2 subsequent coups put Mobutu fully in power as a Western puppet dictator. He received economic and military support throughout his reign from the US, France, and Belgium. This was primarily because he was seen as an anti-communist ally in the region. Many newly independent countries, familiar with the blunt end of capitalist development, were using their independence to move away from Western control. Like many of the region's dictators of the time, Mobutu was kept in power to counteract this development. Congo was mired by bribes, executions, and corruption at every level. Mobutu himself siphoned off around 95% of the government's annual budget by 1992, and accumulated around $5 billion in wealth. This left what little infrastructure did exist in ruin, and the Congolese people hungry, sick, and impoverished. Mobutu's rule eventually ended in 1997, shortly after the First Congolese War with Rwanda and Uganda. The end of the Cold War had meant the end of Mobutu's strategic use to the West, and therefore a massive drop in their support of the regime. Rwanda and Uganda sponsored the rebel group which killed Mobutu and installed a puppet leader in his stead, who was assassinated a few years later. His son, Joseph Kabila, ascended to his place as dictator in another coup shortly after, which laid further foundation to the current events within Congo. This period of instability led to widespread human rights abuses and looting. In 2010, the UNHCHR accused Uganda, Rwanda, and others of crimes against humanity, including genocide. No one has ever faced consequences for this. Joseph Kabila and the interests he served established a kleptocracy, substantially enriching himself and his family in the process, much like Mobutu did before him. By 2019, elections of dubious legitimacy put the current president, Felix Tshisekedi, in power. It's worth mentioning that out of the Congo's 110 million strong population, only 16% had taken part in this election, with even fewer voting for Tshisekedi. Unsurprisingly, the average person's life changed very little following this triumph of democracy. The humanitarian crisis in the DRC is multifaceted. There are countless militias and other armed groups operating within the state, each controlling swaths of territory and committing their own atrocities. Government forces aren't much better, as they routinely abuse citizens and fail in their security duties. Various ethnic conflicts are worsened by the security situation, and frequently devolve into violent clashes. Gendered and sexual violence is endemic across the conflict, and an estimated 6.1 million people have become internally displaced, around 6.5% of the population. Of the armed groups operating in the DRC, by far the most prominent is the March 23rd movement, or M23. It's been responsible for a slew of atrocities, including intentional targeting of civilians, torture, child recruitment, and mass rape. They are currently active in the North Kivu province, which borders Rwanda, as they were originally a proxy force for the neighboring nation. Rwanda provides the movement with material support, including arms, strategic aid, and even direct military assistance. Both Rwanda and Uganda have refused to extradite M23 officers. The presence of M23 is cited as the main reason for the presence of UN and East African Community, or EAC, forces. However, there are several other international militia groups who use the instability of the DRC to gain influence within the country. Another group of some prominence is the Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, which are a Ugandan rebel group operating across the DRC-Uganda border. This pressure on the Congolese military has led them to rely on militia groups themselves. For example, the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, or FDLR, is a Rwandan insurgency group in the DRC which opposes the March 23rd movement on ethnic grounds, and whose leaders are in part responsible for the 1994 Rwandan genocide. The Congolese military themselves are responsible for various war crimes, though they've become even more complicit in the worsening crisis following the incorporation of these militia groups. As a result, even in stabilized regions, citizens are arbitrarily detained in inhumane conditions, freedoms of expression and assembly are non-existent, and political opposition is faced with detention and police violence. Corruption is rampant, while serious crimes face no punishment. This failure of governance contributes to growing intercommunal strife by forcing violent escalation over stable court proceedings. No real steps have been taken to implement a proper electoral system or protect citizens of the DRC. The DRC is estimated to be the richest country in the world based on the value of raw material resources the nation sits on. This is a result of the sheer amount of precious metals in the country, including gold, cobalt, and copper. Very few Congolese benefit from these reserves, despite their extensive exploitation, particularly by Western multinational conglomerates. The instability of the DRC provides an easy way to get resources out of the country, with much of the looted wealth, particularly by militias, being sold off at low prices, making money for whoever can get a hold of it on the global market. It also prevents the Congolese people from developing any proper political and state structures to push for fair compensation. In a stereotypical turn of events, a kleptocratic state and various loose militia groups are supported by international capital and its tendrils in order to sell resources at rock-bottom prices, resulting in the deep impoverishment of the entire nation, except of course those in positions of power. Given how lucrative this black market trade has become, Rwanda's top export is now also gold, despite relatively low domestic production, which indicates that a large portion originates from Congo, and that Rwanda is being used as a middleman to sidestep the humanitarian crisis. A major example highlighting the way the current Congolese state enriches foreign capitalists is with the sale of the KMT mine. The mine extracted cobalt and copper, but was forced to close after the government stripped the Canadian company running it of its license. This was then sold far below its value to an Israeli billionaire with links to then-President Kabila. This was proven to be an act of blatant corruption, enriching US hedge funds and billionaires along with a few Congolese officials at the cost of its people and the nation as a whole. The situation is further exacerbated by the systemic and forced underdevelopment of Congolese infrastructure. Due to a lack of expertise and productive capacity, the DRC is forced to export almost entirely raw materials. For example, it exported less than $2 million of artisanal gold in recent years. Meanwhile, 4 of the DRC's 5 top exports are raw materials, such as unrefined copper or crude oil. The lack of opportunity to turn these raw inputs into more technically sophisticated or developed commodities directly plays into the mechanism of unequal exchange, in which raw resources are exchanged for embodied resources on global markets at a significant loss, whether that's in labor, monetary value, energy expenditure, climate burden, or all of the above. This inability to create finished products results in massive value being extracted as its raw resources are sold at a fraction of the price of the products they eventually create in more developed economies. Keeping the DRC in turmoil keeps its people permanently at the very bottom of this chain of value, which is only exacerbated by a complete lack of human rights which keeps operating costs low in labor-intensive industries. The future of security in the DRC looks bleak. While the withdrawal of UN and EAC forces may seem like a significant part of the current crisis, according to Amnesty, the presence of these forces did not lead to a decrease in attacks on civilians or number of atrocities committed. The EAC is also unpopular with the Congolese people, largely due to Rwanda's ability to influence the organization. The fact that these forces have achieved so little, and the lack of international support for radical change, prevents significant improvements in the country. Social inequality continues to rise, raising with it the price of luxuries like gold and diamonds, while the green transition will push up copper and cobalt prices, which results in a direct economic incentive for the suppression of positive change within the DRC. The country does have an election coming up, with some public support for opposition leaders, though this election, much like previous ones, should be viewed very skeptically. Even basic prerequisites such as proper electoral infrastructure or the release of a public electoral register against which votes can be compared have not been met. This is further worsened as international electoral observation teams withdraw from the country. But the fundamental issue within the DRC isn't the legitimacy of elections, but instead the lack of necessary material conditions for a combined effort at economic development for the nation as a whole. This begins fundamentally with calls for nationalization and anti-corruption drives which continue to be severely repressed. The Congolese people have lived under Western-backed dictatorships exploiting their national resources their entire lives. They are denied security, education, media, and the freedom to organize and agitate. The need for a revolutionary transitional period is as clear as ever, and for all the same reasons Lumumba so accurately analyzed over half a century ago. To defend the nation from economic imperialism is to correct the major failing of history imposed on the Congolese people for so long by an uncaring and unrepentant capitalism and European and American imperialism. These analysis episodes are only possible thanks to our generous patrons. As a little thank you for your support, all patrons get early access to analysis episodes, as well as an audio version of the news. So if you'd like to help support the show, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/firstthought. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.